Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
As ever to the papers, not quite a picture of a hedgehog, but the next best thing. Boris like some kind of sea creature emerging from the top of the Sunday Times there. They've got a new book about Brexit and lots of stories there. Most papers, including the Sunday Times, are leading with overseas stories, above all the great siege of Mosul. Very interesting report there by a brave Times reporter. We'll be talking with that later on about that. Sunday Telegraph, meanwhile, going for the Calais migrant story. You remember all those debates about whether children were really children, should their teeth be checked and so forth. Queuing for Britain is their headline there. The Mail on Sunday is a story about the Tory chief whip smearing somebody, apparently, in a gay smear, it says. Unfortunately, it won't tell us who's being smeared, so we're perhaps slightly less interested than we would otherwise be. The Observer, meanwhile, has leading banks set to pull out of Brexit, UK, early next year. But again, it's not actually the bank saying that, it's a lobbyist for banks, so slightly less interested. Many other stories, but let's kick off. Where are we going to start? I guess, David? We're starting with you? No, we're not. We're starting with Amanda Platel.
Yeah.
We're starting with Amanda Platel and the front page of the Sunday Telegraph.
We're starting with the Sunday Telegraph. Once again, we have a picture of these queues of men who, some of them look like children, some of them don't, waiting to get queuing up in the immigration centre to get over to Britain. But this piece in the Sunday Telegraph is quite interesting, really, some of the stats in it, because it says that ministers ignored offers for help from social services. It's just, this whole thing has just been a complete mess from start to finish. They were supposed to be sending social workers over there to check some of these kids to find, you know, the really vulnerable children. They didn't do it. And they seem to have left the whole thing right till the very last.
And if you're interested about children, the allegation is that men are pushing themselves to the front of the queue and pushing children behind them, as it were, to come in.
Exactly. And the whole point of Lord Dubbs's amendment, which came through in April, was basically that they wanted unaccompanied minors. And they've identified 200 of the most vulnerable minors in the jungle. And as of, I think it was Thursday night, David, not a single one was here. None of the girls had come over. This is the thing that people kept thinking. We were expecting, like, the kinder kids, the Dubbs kids, to be coming in, children with teddy bears. And instead, you're seeing too many strapping young men. But
girls
the girls
are now beginning to come in.
The girls did come. I mean,
you would think it'd be a relatively easy thing to do, to send people into the camp, identify the kids who are vulnerable and bring them over.
2 days before they were closing the camp down, they were going around with megaphones saying, if there are any girls there, can you come out and let us know you're here? Yeah, I mean, what kind of a system's that?
I've chosen as my first story, if you like, the column by Sarah Baxter in the Sunday Times, because she draws attention to something which I think is a kind of thing. It is so British to concentrate on whether you've got a couple of hairy men out of the first 13 that come, rather than the issue of what a cock-up we've made of getting a relatively few young people over. And it's not just a question, it's a question of selection. Well, we've had plenty of time to do that. And some councils have actually sent their own people, on their own regard, social workers, into Calais.
But then they don't even have places for them when they come
back. Well, they haven't even done a proper vetting of the parental or family connections back in Britain, as they would have done in a standard way if those kids had actually been British in Britain and they'd been talking about resettling them and so on. And you have to say, for all the kind of criticism that there has been by incredibly smug people over here about Angela Merkel, that the Germans have managed the business, or are managing the business, of taking in 800,000 to 1 million people, and we can barely manage to get a couple of thousand people in, let alone kids, etc., without having a huge argument about whether they've got to have dentistry checks, because we haven't even done the basic work. And, you know, it's strikes me the Germans are light
It's really
years
about the
ahead
competence of our immigration service. And Amanda, I think you've got a story
about our
from the Mail
attitude as well.
about the immigration boss.
I mean, this makes fascinating reading. This is a former asylum judge, and he says we basically can't keep people out and then we can't send them home. I mean, the statistics here are just shocking. The Home Office said that there were 12,000 failed asylum seekers and a further 30,000 failed asylum seekers who, over 2 years, who have either disappeared or they just haven't removed. So basically, once you get into the system, and I think this is part of the narrative of the story of these older men coming in, pretending to be children, is that people think it's an abuse of the system. They think it's not fair. We're happy to let people in if we know who they are and if we vet the process. But once they're in, it's just a free-for-all. They just disappear.
We should remember that a lot of these people are coming here because of the war in Afghanistan that we were part of and the collapse of society in Afghanistan, and they've been pushed out. And they can't live in that country because it's too dangerous for them, and they eventually end up here.
That is true, but it's not an argument that really resonates nearly as much as one appealing for young girls and young children and young boys to come to the country. That's the one that really...
Why do they not want to stay in France?
Well, I mean, some do have family over here. Some speak English rather than French. Some of them think there's a better life for whatever reason. People look at things on mobile phones and so on. People send them pictures of where they are, and they think that's better. There are, of course, people that want to go to France, and the vast bulk of them actually want to go to Germany and Sweden.
And the camp is now being closed down, and those migrants are going to be settled in camps all around France in the future. Is the next
a lot of them are saying
happen.
they won't go. They're just going to stay because they want to get to Britain. And one of the other reasons they like it in Britain is because it is easier to access the welfare system here. I mean, that's just a fact.
Right. OK, let's move on to Mosul, which is the other big story I highlighted at the beginning of the paper review, David.
Yeah, now I'm really struck. There's a fantastic report at on the front page of the Sunday Times, and again in the bulk of
Louise Callaghan.
Louise Callaghan. And let's remember Louise Callaghan's name. She tells the story of effectively being with an Iraqi unit that becomes sandwiched between two different bits of ISIS attack and defence and so on. And while she's in the vehicle that she's in, an ISIS mortar lands within 20 feet and explodes within 20 feet. And part of me just simply said, what must it be like for Louise Callaghan's parents reading this story of how her daughter, I mean, there have been several journalists already killed in the siege of Mosul and so on. This is a proper war.
I think it was Anthony Lloyd in the Times yesterday who lost it. His gas mask was stolen on the way in, and he's kind of got packets of digestive biscuits and cigarettes, and he's trying to advise the people around him what to do when you are attacked by snipers and so forth. We have a lot of criticism of journalists on this programme and elsewhere, but there's some bloody brave people doing an extraordinary job.
It is some fantastic writing, and I really recommend it.
Now, I don't know if it's fantastic writing or not. It's a bit of drawing that has appealed to you, Amanda.
Oh, I love this cartoon. Yeah, this is just this is going back to the immigration story. It's just a wonderful picture. You know, the debate is over whether or not they should have dental checks to see their age, and there's got this funny old guy with his dentures in a glass.
Can I just say one thing about this, very briefly? I'm sure some of these guys are over age, but I was at school, I don't know about you, Andy, I was at school with boys who at 14 grew full beards and so on. There were at least two in our class who actually looked about 40 by the time they were 14. So I just counsel people about this. People reach puberty at a slightly different age.
I don't think there are any full-bearded old Lauritonians at 14 that I can remember, but I take your point, Debbie. Now let's move. We have a special award now. We haven't mentioned Brexit yet.
Oh, it's about
quite a long way into the paper review, but we're going to do so now.
Yeah,
David.
We are. I mean, here on the front page of The Observer, we have a story that leads out of Anthony Brown, who is the Chief Executive of the British Bankers Association. And they've made it into a prediction. Now, what I like about this story in particular is essentially, as it's saying, because of the uncertainties about passporting rights, the ability of British financial institutions to trade in Europe after Brexit as if they were European banks and so on, that they are going to begin to relocate. And this is one of... Now, we have a huge phony war going on at the moment, as we know. I mean, it puts 1939 to 1940 absolutely into the shade.
No one has stopped campaigning in the papers after the vote, have they?
Well, but they're bound to, because they simply don't know what's going to happen. But this says in the first few months of 2017. So we're going to have a... Now, what would we take the first few months of 2017 to be?
I think
January to April?
Yeah, before.
Yeah. OK, first. So we will be able to test whether or not a story like this has actually had any truth in it, probably by April of next year.
I think that we'll be pretty sure that there won't be a single one that's moved.
Because on cue, the Sun has exactly the opposite
And
story.
of course, the Sun says that we can expect a £20 billion bounce on the back of Brexit. They only give it 3 paragraphs, so there's not much detail.
Yes.
But once again, they're campaigning. They believe it's a great thing, and they believe that these are just scare stories.
Buried deep in the Sunday Telegraph, deep down, is the story that Nissan is, after all, going to build their cash cow cars in Sunderland. which is a very big story if you're on the pro-leave side. I'm surprised it's not on the front page.
Well, the question is, well, if it's not on the front page, it may be, but they're not totally sure. And the second thing is the question about what the government has done, or what came out and what concretely Theresa May said to the Nissan people. You know, everything is possible providing you're prepared to pay for it. The question is how much you're prepared to pay for it and where else it comes from.
Some deal might have been done to ensure that happening.
I haven't read the story.
OK. In terms of what the government can and cannot do, Chris Grayling, who's coming on the show shortly, is writing in the Sun on Sunday about this very, very big decision, Gatwick or Heathrow. And he says it's going to be a big decision. He doesn't actually tell us what it is.
I know, I'm just dying. There's only one thing people want to know is which one and how. Why don't they just get on with it? You know, I mean, it's going to create so many jobs. It's going to be great for the country. And crack, I can't remember a time when we weren't talking about...
No, Roskill Commission going back... The article could have been written by Roskill back in the mid-70s. However, Amanda, both you and I are looking forward to your getting the answer out of Chris Grayling.
Yes, yes, we know you're going to get...
Because he knows what he really thinks, and it's his job to tell you, and it's your job to get it out of him.
He's going to say it's my job to tell Parliament, I fear, but there's going to be an enormous long drum roll.
He's not going to give you a running commentary.
OK, let's turn to the opposition parties, because we've had by-elections, we haven't talked much about them, but the Liberal Democrats have done really pretty well in David Cameron's constituent in Witney, came second, romped ahead of the Labour Party.
Yeah, well, one of the things that's really interesting about... I mean, firstly, the Liberal Democrats will be saying they've had a string of local council by-election wins, about 20, I think.
They've always had a stream of...
Yeah, I know, actually, they've gone down and so on. So they're gradually inching their way back. In about 20 years, they'll get to where they were in the early 80s and so on. But Witney was a good result for them. What was interesting, however, to me, is that Witney is a seat in which the Labour Party has gone from 500 members to 1,200 members. In the by-election, they got 5,000 votes. Most political party people will tell you that a ratio of 5 voters to every one actual party member is one of the lowest you can possibly achieve.
But there must come a point when Corbyn's ability to recruit an ever bigger membership has some electoral effect. I mean, it is becoming it's Europe's biggest political party.
It is having an electoral effect. It's pushing the Labour vote down.
Well, the time will come when surely they reach that.
One of the things I always tell my kids is the word surely almost always means its opposite.
All right, now, something that means the opposite. No means no. This is the Poldark row.
I know, it's for
those who haven't seen it, Amanda, just explain what happened and why there is a row going on.
He's basically was in love with this woman.
It's tonight,
yes,
we should say.
It's tonight, and I'll be watching
It's a spoiler alert.
And he is Ross Poldark.
He is Ross Poldark. He is in love with the posh one who's called Elizabeth, I think.
Yeah.
But he ended up marrying a kind of gorgeous, feisty Demelza, who is a common girl. But he's always had he's always held a torch for her. She's a widow now, and there's a scene.
In short, he rapes her.
In short, this is the debate. The BBC says it isn't rape, and so the Mail has done this fantastic spread. They've talked to lots of unknown rape experts.
Well, hardly rape experts.
She says no.
She says no 3 times, but evidently she doesn't look frightened. There's this quote at the bottom here, which I just love, from one of the experts. She says, "Her actions aren't fitting with a woman frozen with fear. Many women do have quite violent fantasies. A lot of women might think, I wish my husband would take me like that."
Well, a lot of people will...
I have two daughters in college and one in her mid-20s, and the last thing I want is them meeting young men who are informed by the psychotherapist who is quoted at the end of this article. I think the BBC have dropped one. I think the BBC have dropped one here.
Look, the thing from it looks like one of those completely borderline cases, and everyone wants them to get it together. That's the problem with it, you know. It's,
well, that's something for everyone to talk about.
But we can watch it tonight if we're not watching Strictly Come Dancing dance off with Ed Balls.
At that moment, we haven't mentioned that. Thank you both very much indeed.
Now, a few days ago, Sir Philip Green told me he's so very, 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 very sorry for the mess at BHS. But MPs say he's not sorry enough, so can they have that knighthood back, please? Was it fluff or ghoul, as England's most famous striker laid into those who want proof that the child migrants we're taking from Calais really are children? Now, her after-dinner speech to European leaders in Brussels when she insisted the UK would be playing a full part in the EU till Brexit got no laughs at all. And I have to show this man's mugshot. Yes, it's Lib Dem leader Tim Farron. Let's hope not for the last time, because whisper it softly, there's been a Lib Dem surge in the Whitley by-election, which they lost, of course. Now, always surging, never beaten, it's Allegra and Screeny.
Never beaten, but me and my electrical screen, not so keen on the surging bit. But look, there's been no clear theme in the papers this morning. You've got The Observer. They're saying banks are going to pull out of Brexit UK early next year. Over on The Telegraph, they're saying the Home Office was warned years ago adults would pose as child migrants to get into the UK. But the key thing is, I've looked at all of these front pages, and there actually is not a single Jeremy Corbyn piece on the front page. Now, this plays into some research that came out this week, which is quite interesting. Over the last 3 months, you can see all the mentions in the press for the leaders. You've got David Cameron in blue, Theresa May way out the front now, here in green, and almost falling off the map, you have in red Jeremy Corbyn. Now, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe instead of him, you are looking to MPs and Parliament in general to make a difference, because look at this. These are some of the most shared articles this week. The most shared political one is that MPs are to vote on Brexit at some point. The second one was MPs did vote to strip Philip Green of his knighthood. That got nearly 150,000 signatures in a petition. And then here at the end, Lineker defending child refugees. 85,000 have signed a petition on that. After years of saying MPs are absolutely useless, maybe some of you are revising your opinion. Now, one man who has found a new use for himself is our friend Ed Balls. If you haven't seen him, this is him last night. It's actually his fourth lift. The others were all right, but he nearly drops her. Everyone at home is shouting, he nearly drops her. And Robert is actually, Robert is corpsing over there. And as David Schneider, the comedian, said, this is the last Labour election campaign expressed through the medium of dance. Robert.
I think I might have to express myself through the medium of dance for my two absolutely brilliant guests, Jess Phillips, Kwasi Kwarteng, the two individuals who we hope will tell us what's really going on in the minds of their respective leaders. I'm going to start with you, Kwasi Kwarteng. Kwasi, we've had sort of dribbling out more and more information about what Theresa May actually knew about things that were going wrong at this very important child abuse inquiry. Now, you know, perhaps her strongest selling point is she's supposed to be a safe pair of hands. And, you know, certainly the impression that's being created is that she wasn't on top of this. Do you think we've got now the worst out in terms of...
No, I don't take your analysis at all. I mean, what you have to remember about the Prime Minister, about Theresa, is that she was in the Home Office for a very long time. She was there for 6 years, which was, I think, the longest period since the war. And during that time, I was always struck as a backbench MP how little scandal, how little sort of controversy was surrounding her tenure of that office. And historically, that's a very demanding office. It's been described as a graveyard for politicians.
In this case,
and she held.
It's been awful.
I don't know the full details about this, but what I do know is that she was a very impressive Home Secretary, and as a consequence of her success, she's now the Prime Minister, and as far as I can see, she's enjoying extremely favourable ratings in the polls. People like the fact that she's Prime Minister.
But, you know, we've had statement being contradicted by further statement, out of Downing Street about who knew what when. Which is very damaging.
I don't think it is damaging. I think that...
You're not a victim of childhood sexual abuse, and let me tell you, for them, the whole thing, from the beginning to end, if there is anything about her legacy in the Home Office that is a disaster, it is the child abuse inquiry. As somebody who worked for years with those people, it is as if there is something to hide, and the constant stop-starting, losing data, that, the other. She has not been a safe pair of hands for those people.
Let's look at this in the round. She actually set up the inquiry. I think there was some resistance for an inquiry in the first place. I think they have had difficulties in terms of people's impartiality and people being connected with the establishment, so-called. But I think this is the step in the right direction. I think she's shown real leadership, actually, in having the inquiry in the first place. And there's no doubt that, and I've been in Parliament 6 years now, she has a fund of goodwill, and people genuinely think she's a very capable Prime Minister.
But you think she's going to get a lot worse in terms of the revelations?
I don't think that she, at the moment, the whole safe pair of hands thing is on completely dodgy ground, because nothing seems safe. I don't know what the outcome of anything is going to be. And as a Prime Minister, where, you know, I didn't want a Tory Prime Minister, but I was glad when Theresa May stepped up. At the moment, I'm starting to feel like the country isn't safe again.
But look,
I've got to come back to you in just a couple of minutes.
I'm joined now by the human rights campaigner, Peter Tatchell, by the Conservative peer, Baroness Neville-Jones, who used to chair the Joint Intelligence Committee, and by the journalist, Beth Gardner, who writes for the New York Times. Very good morning to you all. Let's dive in. Beth, we'll stay with you, and let's stay with something you know an awful lot about, the American election and Donald Trump. You've got two stories we'll roll together in the Times. Too wild, Trump for the West, and in the Observer, he's going to sue some of his accusers, apparently. Take us through them.
Yeah, well, this Trump too wild for the West story caught my eye because I think it really sums up where we are now in this campaign 2 weeks ahead of Election Day. Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, is in danger of losing Utah. Gloria Steinem, of all people, was campaigning there for Hillary Clinton a few days ago. This is
just explain to the British public, you know, what a bombshell that would be.
Sure, absolutely, because Utah is a rock-ribbed conservative state, you know, easily won by any Republican nominee in the past. What we've been seeing happen over the last couple of weeks, since I think the turning point was the first debate, where the Donald Trump meltdown really began in the days following, and it's only gotten worse with the tape of him talking about sexually assaulting women and the various women who've come forward. He is now in danger of losing states that have been very reliably in the Republican column for many years, and Hillary Clinton is pushing hard because I think she's feeling pretty comfortable now with her 6 or 7 point lead, and she would really like to have a very decisive win, in part to quash some of these conspiracy theories that Trump has been putting forward.
Just to bring in our other reviews, I mean, Peter, do you think, though, some of the acrimony, and, you know, that's probably a polite way of putting it, that this campaign has generated, do you think some of that might linger, particularly with this Donald Trump line about, you know, well, I'll reserve judgment on whether I accept the result or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite scary because, of course, he has a lot of, some might say, quite wild followers, and who may know what they do if he loses. And one could easily imagine sort of the rise of extreme right-wing groups seeking to challenge the election result, not just in the courts, but in mass protests. And you know, some of these extremist groups are armed, and they have, some of them have made noises about not accepting the result.
Would you have concerns, Dame Pauline, if you know, was President Trump, and particularly about some of his foreign policy pronouncements, about his attitude towards Putin, about what he said he'd do to Syria and things?
No, some of them are pretty frightening. I mean, I suppose, like a lot of people, I hope that he's not going to win, but I don't think the populism that he represents is going to die. And I think that's one of the issues. And what's more, though I think the Senate may go Democrat, the House is unlikely to. So there's still going to be tension inside the system. So how much President Clinton's going to be able to do, I think, is another question.
Well,
I think the standoff in American politics may continue.
I think that's why you're seeing her now pushing so hard into the red states. It's partly about what Peter raised, this question of legitimacy and will there be...
Push it back.
Right, and it's partly about winning the Senate and maybe the House.
Yeah. What about, I want to move on to some other stories, but let's just, this threatening to sue some of the women who accused him, could be a dangerous strategy.
Well, this is again, you know, an indication of what an unconventional candidate this is. 2 weeks before an election, any conventional candidate on either side of the divide, you would expect to be absolutely relentlessly on message at this point in the campaign. Trump went to Gettysburg, of all places. When you go to Gettysburg as an American politician, you are raising the bar as high as it gets. That's where Abraham Lincoln gave, you know, probably the greatest and most consequential political speech in American history. Trump went there and said, I'm going to sue all these liars after the election. You know, so this is not what the Republican Party wants to see him doing. They would like, even if victory is beyond his reach at this point, they would like to see him narrow the margin with Hillary Clinton because, as Dame Pauline just mentioned, what is now at stake is the Senate and the House, and the bigger the margin of victory is for Hillary Clinton, the harder it is going to be for the Republican candidates to overcome.
Baroness Neville-Jones, bringing the battle for Mosul. I was discussing it with Roy Stewart a little bit earlier. It's not going to be easy, is it?
No, and I think it's not going to be a quick one either, and I think partly deliberately, because the Allied forces, so to speak, the Iraqis on the one hand, which were greatly helped by coalition forces, and also the Peshmerga, and they're doing a sort of pincer movement on Mosul. one of their big priorities is to reduce the level of civilian death. So they are taking it very carefully, and I think therefore fairly slowly. And the problem, I think, is it's not at all clear, you know, whether this is going to turn out to be a set-piece battle with ISIS, or whether they will actually, in the end, escape. You know, they will just disperse, having left behind the most terrible massacres. It's clearly already happening. That the civilian population is being used as human shields, being subjected to torture as well as oppression. It's a very, very nasty situation. So the consequences of Mosul, you know, are big. First of all, you can get a dispersal of terrorists to, you know, other parts of the Middle East and possibly also returnees, Europe. And secondly, there is then the question of what kind of governance in that part of the world. By then, the one gain in all of this, political gain in all of this, is that ISIS will no longer really be able to claim a caliphate. It's reduced to an area around Raqqa. You know, it's diminished. So that claim is undermined. But it's replaced, of course, by the huge problems of what kind of governance you put in place for this area, very mixed area of Sunni majority, but also lots of minorities, and also the Kurds. And that was one of the things, you know, that destroyed Iraq first time round after the coalition left. So we cannot just leave them to their own devices. There has to be a proper follow-through.
I mean, we could discuss this thorny issue for the entirety of this paper review, but let's bring in some more stories. Peter, you've got this interesting one within the Times about universities likened to slave plantations.
Yeah, the Sunday Times did a very good story by Professor Andrews, the first black studies professor based at Birmingham City University. He has accused the university system of institutional racism on a par with the police. He's noted the fact that over 92% of British professors are white, that out of the 14,000 senior academic posts in British universities, only 60 are held by black men and women, and that when it comes to academic performance, black and ethnic minority students are much more likely to drop out of class and not get top-class degrees. So I think he's raised a really important issue.
It's really been highlighted before, hasn't it?
Yeah, we think about universities.
It's astonishing.
We think about universities as liberal, enlightened places where equality and diversity rules, but quite clearly that is not the case.
Well, equality didn't reign for women until quite recently, and even now it doesn't. You know, the top hamper is still largely male and largely white. Yeah. So you know, this is a broad minorities issue still, I think. But point well taken.
Got another story coming up from Beth, The Observer. 50 refugee girls arrive after a U-turn by officials, and this is what's going on with.
Yeah, I thought that was a very powerful
Calais.
story. We're awaiting now, obviously, the dismantling of this camp in Calais, and the fear that is, you know, gripping people there, particularly the younger refugees, some of whom are minors and some of whom are on their own as they wait for you know, their uncertain fate. This piece on the front of the Observer is looking at a group of, I think, 54 girls, refugees from Eritrea, who were the first now to enter this country under the Dubs Amendment, which was passed quite a few months now, I think, quite a few months ago now. There's also a lot of criticism in there from some of the aid agencies of the way the Home Office has handled this situation. You know, whether it's a reluctance on an ideological basis or a security basis or a fear of political backlash to, you know, admit some of these refugees under the Dubs Amendment. There also seems to have been a real sort of cack-handedness just in terms of competence and you know, making the wheels turn.
I want to get the views of you two about how do you think the government's been handling this, and what do you put down? Beth calls it reluctance. What do you put that down to, Dame Pawnee?
Well, I think, I mean, a number of things, including, I think, the sheer difficulty of sorting the children.
Sure.
And knowing what was what, and clearly that is a real issue. But I have to say that the Home Office has lost the public relations battle in this. I mean, from way back, you know, they should have reacted much. We shouldn't have needed to have the Dubs Amendment. And having got the Dubs Amendment, they needed really to pull their finger out. And one of the pieces of the story does seem to be that they didn't ask for help from people who could have helped them until relatively recently. And so now you face a...
What's really outrageous is that hundreds of these children have family in this country and are legally entitled to be here, but they're being kept in Calais for months and years. That's the real scandal. And
you think that's deliberate?
I think it, of course
I
it
think
is.
it's
Of course it's
incompetence.
deliberate.
No, I think it's incompetence.
And it's now having to be sorted in a matter literally of hours when there ought to have been months. I wonder if there's an element of distraction too, political distraction. Dubs was passed in May, wasn't it? And the Brexit vote happened in June. Well, the government's been busy with other things.
OK, couple more stories. Peter, this one catches my eye that you've picked deep inside the Sunday Telegraph today, the last British hero of the anti-fascist war.
Stan Hilton has died at the age of 98. He volunteered to fight in the international brigades against Franco's fascists in the 1930s, and he has just sadly died. He's was the last living member of that international brigades. And what I think is, it's worth marking that heroic struggle against fascism. But it's also, I think, an interesting contrast between the attitude of the left then and the attitude of the left now. We don't see any left-wing solidarity with the people of Syria, with the Democrats, the left-wingers, the civil society activists in Syria, who are there in their hundreds of thousands. Everything is being portrayed as a struggle between Assad and the terrorists.
But you were on demonstration yesterday, weren't you?
I was, yeah.
You didn't see any of the Stop the War Coalition and others?
On that protest, to defend and support the civilian population of Aleppo, there was not a single left-wing or student banner. Years ago, the left and students stood in solidarity with civilians under attack, like that terrible, terrible bombing that's going on right now in Aleppo. I'm a left-winger, but not that kind of left. I'm really depressed and saddened and angry that the left have deserted those Democrats within Syria who want a democratic state, and the people who, of course, began the whole episode with their peaceful protests in 2011, which Assad responded by massacring.
Boris Johnson says that kind of thing as well.
Well, good for him, but we need action. And I'd say to Boris Johnson, if he's really concerned, why isn't he pressing for an emergency special session of the United Nations General Assembly to mandate a UN no-bombing zone and civilian safe havens? The Security Council can be overridden by the General Assembly, so Russia cannot veto if there's a General Assembly vote. And that's what Boris Johnson and other leaders should be doing, going direct to the General Assembly, demanding a special session.
Okay. Our last story is the dimension of that, and you have it, Baroness Neville-Jones. Russia heading for a new Cold War. What do you mean heading for?
Well, if you look at, there's a very frightening statement by a Russian general. If we talk about the last Cold War, we are currently somewhere between the erection of the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So anybody is old enough to remember that, and I do, that's a very frightening statement. Now, I think that's an exaggeration. Nevertheless, the world is pretty tense. The problem with what you just said, Peter, is, the Russians can't ignore a General Assembly resolution and simply not comply with a no-fly zone, which would create an extremely dangerous situation if they contested it. So I think we are in Aleppo. This is the sort of sharp end of a much broader, I fear, mounting level of tension between Old East and West, whether it's in Ukraine, where the Russians don't really care about the future of Ukraine. What they really want to do is simply prevent Ukraine or coming into the Western orbit. And they'll wreck the country. They don't want a settlement, they just want to spoil it. There's a lot of trouble in the Baltic, there's a lot of trouble in the Baltic republics and in the Baltic Sea, violation of airspace and under submarine activity. We saw the Russian aircraft carrier come down the channel. This is all provocation, upping the ante. Why Putin does not have a successful economy at home? He needs to make clear the world is actually against Russia, and that's the problem.
Peter, I'll give you a few words.
You're absolutely right, yeah. And it underlies the fact, the way in which the Russian military has been restructured towards a long-range offensive capacity.
And they're now
very different from the past. It's copying the worst excesses of British and American imperialism.
And they're becoming politically dominant, and it's really worrying.
All right, Peter, Pauline, Beth, very good to see you all. Plenty to chew over with your muffins this morning, whatever you're having. I'm joined now by Sky's senior political correspondent, Beth Rigby, the Sun on Sunday's political editor, David Wooding, and the Independent's political columnist, Steve Richards. Very good morning to you all. There's never any shortage, is there, of material for us to deal with? Well, let's start, Beth, with something, you know, that's partly been generated on this programme just a few minutes ago. The UKIP leadership battle. And stat me, it looks like it's going to be messy.
Another leadership battle, another messy lot of UKIP. I mean, it is going to be messy. You had Raheem on just now. You brought up all the issues he's had about how he behaves on social media, things he's said about other political leaders, some awful things that he said publicly on Twitter about Nicola Sturgeon in the referendum debate. It makes him, by definition, a controversial character, but add into that Aaron Banks, the big UKIP funder, is backing him, and it therefore also makes him quite a serious contender. We also have Suzanne Evans, and I think the thing about UKIP is, you touched on that when Raheem Kassam was talking about the National Executive and how the party needs restructuring. There are two very, very distinct groups within the party. There are the Farage gang, and he's part of that, as is Aaron Banks. And then there's other people, the modernisers such as the Douglas Carswells. And even once this leadership battle is decided, I just don't see how those two sides can come back together.
I mean, even if at the leadership level it starts to fall apart, does it really matter? I mean, there's a demand within the United Kingdom for a party or an organisation that is against the elites.
That's right. The problem they have is they're trying to reach out to the Labour voters, and they've got this slight issue here with Raheem being of the right. He's more or less Nigel Farage on speed, if you like. And then Suzanne Evans, who's a more moderate character who can't even decide whether she wants to support Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. She's a more on the one hand, on the other hand person. Which are they going to go for? I suspect that the UKIPers, the membership, which is who they're appealing to, will probably go for more of a right person at the moment. But whether that is the right person to take UKIP on and reach out to the working class people in the north of England, which is their stated aim, would be another matter.
And is it the fact, Steve, I mean, you know, they've won the Brexit vote. Are they going to struggle then to develop a wider range of policies that appeal?
Yeah, I think they'd have struggled if they'd lost the Brexit vote. I think it's very interesting what's happening with UKIP. And it shows how difficult it is to form a sustainable political party. If you look at the Tory and Labour parties, they're the most fragile they've been in their history, both of them. And if you look at a very different kind of new political party, the SDP in the 80s, they lasted a few years and then imploded. And UKIP are discovering that political parties are awkward, complex beasts. You can't just depend on a single charismatic leader, i.e. Nigel Farage. And yet, who have you got underneath, and what do you stand for? And they're going through all these agonies. And I think, even though there clearly is an appetite for these outsiders at the moment across the democratic world, I think they're in real trouble.
Well, let me expand that and move
to
the next perennial issue. Sorry to cut across you, Steve, but you know, it's the issue of Brexit. Now, interesting point you make about new parties, because there's been talk for some time now, haven't there? You know, and I was talking to Tim Farron earlier about a kind of reorganisation, perhaps around the second referendum issue, those Labour refuseniks, Tim Farron, SNP, and others. I mean, if that ever did come about, do you think that would just be a loose coalition on that single issue?
I think it would be a loose coalition on that single issue, because on many other issues they disagree. But on that issue, there's unquestionably a coming together. I mean, to take one example, Ed Miliband, who's been keeping a low profile, decided after visiting Hollande's people in France that they had to campaign for a soft Brexit in the Commons. He phoned on the way back, very out of character for him, spontaneously, a Tory MP, and said, we've got to get together on this. She responded to his surprise wholly positively, and within minutes had phoned others. And so these Remainers in the Commons and elsewhere, I think, are coalescing around, at the very least, a sort of soft Brexit campaign. That doesn't mean a new political party, but I think on that issue, they're going to act.
Nodding there, Beth. Is there trouble ahead?
I think there is, and I think also what's really fascinating about that splash in the Observer today is it's not just politicians now coalescing.
Just explain that about the banks.
This is about the banks, about the banks warning that a hard Brexit, if you like, an exit from the single market, will have huge ramifications for the City of London, warning that banks will move jobs out of London.
there was a report actually from City UK, which is a lobby group, but it was done by independent consultants, warning that there would be potentially 10 billion of lost revenue in tax revenue from the city to the Treasury in the event of this hard Brexit, as they talk about. So I think that this coalition is not just political. I think there will be business. I think there will be a popular coalition as well of people that voted to remain. And I've noticed, I don't know if you've noticed, but around London, I often am getting stopped now by people canvassing and leafleting about, are you one of the 48%? Do you want to join our movement? So I think it's a broader...
But it's the important thing you say around London, as David's picking up on, and also this coalition of business and the great and the good. They fought for Remain during the campaign and lost.
I've always said one of the reasons that so many journalists called it for Remain was because we live in a bubble, the Westminster bubble, which is inside another bubble, the London bubble. And there are a lot of people out there who voted for Brexit who don't live in London and think that we're all elitists down here, and with some justification in many cases. And I think that the problem with for the government now is, are these Remainers or Remoners, if you want to call them the others disparagingly, are they hindering the cause of negotiation? Because one of the problems David Cameron had was that he didn't ask for enough, and he was being held back a little bit, it is claimed, by civil servants. He wasn't quite strong enough. And if they're all coming out with reasons why we need a soft Brexit, that's playing into the hands of the European leaders who are already talking about playing it hard and negotiating in French and so on.
I totally agree with that, but I think the sort of the mismatch between what's discussed here and then how Theresa May is received on the continent shows there is this yawning gap between expectation and what they can deliver. But I think at the end of the day, in the months ahead, if the economy does start to contract, if businesses do stop investing, and I'm not saying that will happen. I mean, Nissan, there's positive signs about the Sunderland. I'm not saying that will happen, but I think that will overtake the political impetus.
But ultimately, does it lead? I mean, we're describing the stresses and strains already in so many months and years to run. But ultimately, Steve, I mean, does it lead to some kind of vote on whatever shape of the deal? Perhaps not a second referendum, but maybe an early general election. Even if Theresa May has to use that to sort her party out.
I don't think there will be an early general election. I mean, let's be precise. There's talk about one next spring.
Yeah.
And although on one level it's obvious that she should do it because she's miles ahead in the polls at the moment, I don't think there will be, because what would be the cause? She won't know at that point what her Brexit deal would be.
Well, could it be losing in the courts on Article 50?
But that wouldn't be enough to... I mean, what would she go to the country about? And would it be with the support of her parliamentary party, or would it be because she hasn't got the full support of her parliamentary party that she goes to the country in order to get a majority, in which case she would be partly turning on her own party, a bit of it, to justify the election. So I mean, I might be in a minority here. I bump into people all the time, not least Labour MPs, who think she's going to do it. I don't.
All right. Anyone else think she might?
I think she won't. I think she won't do it either. I agree with Steve.
Do you?
Yeah, I do. I think. I mean, all the signs show that she will. But I did an interview with her just before the Conservative Party conference,
I read it.
And she was pretty dogged about it. And politicians always leave themselves a little bit of wiggle room.
I would say in public and in private, everyone briefing very hard against that. And actually, a minister said to me the other day that part of the reason that was for her. There's no benefit to replay all this blue-on-blue divisions in an election.
That would be the only context of an early election.
And why would she want to do that?
Yeah.
She's struggling. We can see that in all these briefings against the Treasury and how, you know, and the cabinet leaks, which she must absolutely hate. You can see how fraught underneath the surface of unity the party is.
Well, let me throw into the issue of unity, because, you know, Heathrow and a decision about another runway in the southeast. Should we see that then, that decision or non-decision or long grass decision or whatever it's going to be, through the prism of disunity and not wanting to rock the boat even more with another issue?
It's been an issue of party management for years now. I remember seeing David Cameron, when he was leader of the opposition, when he ruled out Heathrow and said it would be impossible, it would never happen. And he did an article where he said we'd spend the money from Heathrow on high-speed rail or something. You know, there was some sort of contortion. It was all about kind of showing who he was at that point. And now, I mean, if what we read is true, that there's going to be a sort of, the cabinet can argue either way, which is always dangerous, as we've seen from Europe, and it goes on for another year. I wonder whether mid-term, which is where they'll be in another year, they'll be in a position to take a really contentious decision. If that's, is that what it is? They're going to delay it for another year? We're in mid-term territory then.
I think we'll get a decision on Tuesday. I suspect it will be Heathrow.
But contingent on a public...
But then, yes. But this was always going to happen. There was always going to be public inquiries and appeals and goodness knows what, which is why it's important to take the decision, because it's been kicked into the long grass for so long.
It has.
And Heathrow has fallen from being the world's busiest airport to, I think it's the 6th or 7th.
That's all right. Yeah. I mean, but then Zach Goldsmith apparently would resign at some point. That would be an interesting by-election, given what happened in Witney with the Lib Dems.
Yeah, it would. But I mean, he's consistently said he would do that. I think she's going to have again an issue here, because wasn't there an agreement that up until the decision, or while that planning consultation is going through, people can, cabinet ministers can have a free voice on this? So you're going to have
apparently not in the House of Commons
but you will have this other situation whereby the government will be putting forward a decision, and there will be a load of people on the front bench. I mean, you'll have Justine Green and Boris Johnson complaining against it. I don't actually see how in this situation she can do anything but give her cabinet ministers a free vote on it. But it just speaks of splits at the top of the party at a time when she's going to be having to navigate through triggering Article 50. I think it's going to be a very difficult year for her.
The other big issue here is the big political picture. Theresa May's talking about building a Britain that works for everybody, and she's now finding she's not going to be able to please everybody, because whatever decision she makes here is going to upset some people.
Yeah, it's starting to feel like that sort of John Major, triumph in the 92 election, and then Maastricht came, and that triumph wasn't very long lasting, and it became very, very difficult. And I think it's going to be difficult for her. I mean, she's a substantial figure, but I think it's going to be difficult.
But the one thing I would say is, if I was the Prime Minister in my first 100 days and I had the level of leaking from the Cabinet in that shorter period of time, that bodes
which is the honeymoon period.
That bodes really badly for her. She should be able to control her Cabinet in a way that it doesn't appear to be doing.
What's this space?
She's not doing so.
The inside word. Thank you very much indeed. Very good to see you all.